Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the California ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Variable Operations and Maintenance Cost Review 2023 meeting to discuss the draft final proposal. My name is Caitlin McGee, representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group here at the ISO, and I'll be helping facilitate today's meeting. I'm also joined by Kevin Head, Senior Market Engineering Specialist. As a reminder, today the presentation and agenda for this meeting can be found on the Policy Initiatives webpage. That's under the Stay Informed tab of the CAISO homepage. Next slide, please. Before we get started, a few housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These meetings are structured in a way to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives, but we do ask that you please keep your comments professional and respectful and try to be brief and not repeat things that have already been said. Next slide, please. There's a few ways to ask questions or make comments during today's meeting. If you're connected to audio through your computer or using the Call Me option, you can click the raise hand icon in the bottom right toolbar. This will add you to the queue. You can also send your question or comment into the chat box and I'll read it aloud for you. And if you're joining through audio only on your phone, you can click #2 and that'll also add you to the queue. Before asking your question, please remember to state your name and affiliation. And if you need any technical assistance during today's meeting, you can send a chat to the event producer. Next slide. So here's the agenda for today. It's pretty brief. I'm going to hand it over to Kevin here in a minute. He's going to go through the cost review and draft final proposal. We'll have time for a Q&A, and then we'll just wrap it up with next steps. Next slide, please. So Kevin, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. Hey, everybody. This is Kevin Head. Like she said, I'm a market engineering specialist at the ISO. Apologies in advance. They're chopping down a tree down the street from me. So if you hear some background noises, please just raise your hand and excuse any interruptions. So I'll start with just a summary of what we're doing here with this initiative and then provide some background after. So we have a recurring stakeholder process to review these default variable operations and maintenance cost adders once every 3 years. The previous cycle that we did this review was in 2019, or at least it used 2019 as the reference year for inflation adjustment purposes. So 3 years from that 2019 year is the end of 2022, and we have data from the end of 2022, so we're performing the standard triennial update. The VOM adder values that are in place right now, the default values, we gave them a review, looked at some external indicators, internal indicators, and determined that an update to the default values is appropriate because of the high inflation rates during the 2019 to 2022 period. And very simply, we're proposing to do a 16% inflation increase to those default VOM adder values. The next slide has some background. In particular, it discusses what VOM adders are. So these are the variable operations and maintenance adders are used by scheduling coordinators to reflect the cost of operations and maintenance costs in the ISO's markets. Operations costs are things like consumables and water that are consumed during the production of energy. And then maintenance costs are what they sound like. They're wear and tear on the resource as it operates. Importantly, these are only variable O&M costs, so fixed operations and maintenance costs are not included in the ISO's spot markets. The way that the VOM adders are reflected in the market is two different ways. So they're added onto default energy bids, depending on the resources, technology type, et cetera, fuel type. Default energy bids, as a reminder, are used in the market power mitigation process. And they're used specifically to replace a scheduling coordinator's submitted bid with the default energy bid if the resource is determined to have the potential capability to exercise market power. In other words, it's subject to bid mitigation, and that's when the default energy bid comes into effect. And the VOM adders are added to, they're at least a component of the default energy bid for most resource types. Additionally, they're also used in what we call default commitment costs. Default commitment costs are caps on what can be submitted for minimum load costs, startup costs, transition costs, et cetera. And the market uses those commitment costs as kind of what we call those broad category of bids to determine whether or not to start a resource up, to keep it online, or if it's a multi-stage generator, transition it from one configuration to the other. So VOM adders are a component of both default energy bids and default commitment costs. The VOM adders, there's two ways that a resource can receive a VOM adder. One, you can negotiate it with the ISO. That's sort of an individual resource by resource negotiation. If you decide that you don't want to negotiate, the ISO has a set of predetermined values that the resource will just receive with no action taken by the scheduling coordinator. In other words, they're the default VOM adder values. So the next slide has a little bit of history, just to set the table a little bit more. The original VOM framework and the default VOM adder values were first set back in 2012. And in that 2012 stakeholder process, we committed that we would come back and revisit the default VOM adder values once every 3 years. The previous triennial review that we did that I mentioned earlier, that was a much wider scope stakeholder process. In that stakeholder process, we did a number of things. We, for example, proposed a new framework for the VOM costs to be reflected in the market. We introduced some cost categorization principles to help define what variable operations costs are, what variable maintenance costs are. We also hired an external consultant to do a more comprehensive and detailed look at the VOM costs faced by different technology types. And importantly, for our purposes today, the 2019 year was used as a reference year for the purposes of inflation adjustments. Just confirming, can you guys hear me okay? Is everything coming in fine? I just saw something in the chat. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. So this stakeholder process, we're not going through this more comprehensive look at the VOM cost framework and principles and stuff. This is just kind of a standard triennial review of the current default VOM adders that are on the books. So the next slide talks about what the review that we did for 2023 was. So we considered three main factors. The first and most important one was the inflation. I think it's pretty well understood that price levels had increased substantially during that period coming out of the COVID pandemic and the associated supply chain issues, et cetera, that led to large increases in price levels. We also considered the frequency and volume of VOM adder negotiations. The reason why this is relevant is if we were receiving a much higher frequency or a lot more VOM adder negotiations, that might be an indicator that the default values are insufficient in some way and that they might need to be revisited. We did not see that the frequency or the volume of VOM negotiations has deviated from historical patterns significantly. So this is sort of a neutral indicator. Similarly, we looked at other sources of O&M cost data, and we didn't see any conflicting information that conflicts with our existing default VOM adders, but we also didn't find very up-to-date, timely information either. So taking a step back, we looked at these three factors and said, okay, inflation is clearly elevated above historical averages, and so we determined that an update is appropriate. The next slide has what our proposed update is. And very simply, we're proposing just a 16% across the board increase based on the consumer price index change from the end of 2019, December 2019, to December of 2022. And that's the CPI that's published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and there's a bit more detail on that in the paper. We wanted to also, and so you can see here the pre-update values by technology type. And apologize if it's a little small, you can see the values in the draft final proposal that's posted on the ISO website. But the pre-update values, these are the ones that are currently in effect under the ISO's tariff. And then we have the post-updated values, which are just reflecting that 16% increase. To corroborate these values, we did sort of a similar process to what we did in the review. So we looked at the external sources of data. In particular, we looked at the New York ISO's cost of new entry report. And the ISO leaned relatively heavily on the New York ISO's cost of new entry report in developing the current set of VOM adder default values. And so we wanted to make sure that we were going back to that same source to check if anything has changed. Unfortunately, their report, the most recent one, was published back in 2020, and so does not reflect these escalated inflation rates that we saw. So it wasn't really indicative of anything. What we did find useful, though, was we looked at the existing pool of negotiated VOM adder values and compared, we have an internal benchmark value that we develop based on those negotiated values. So we look at all of the negotiations that the ISO has done with scheduling coordinators, it's hundreds of resources, and develop an internal benchmark against which we can compare these proposed default values. We did that comparison. We noticed that the internal benchmarks are just a little bit higher than these proposed default values. And we took that as a good sign because the default values are really just meant to be used in lieu of a negotiation. So the negotiated values by nature are expected to be a little bit higher than the default values because they reflect, individual resources specific costs, and most scheduling coordinators don't go through the negotiation process if the default values are sufficient for their purposes. And because they were just a little bit higher, we took that as a sign that the proposed defaults are in that sort of reasonableness sweet spot between being maybe too high and not and allowing scheduling coordinators to over recover costs while still being high enough to be useful for some scheduling coordinators instead of going through the negotiation process. So taken together with the fact that the CPI is a pretty well understood and respected source of inflation information and corroborating it based on those other factors I explained, we felt that the 16% increase was appropriate. And just a reminder that these are just the default values. And if any scheduling coordinator feels that they're insufficient for their own specific resources purpose, they can come and negotiate a resource-specific value instead of relying on these default values. So that's about it. This is usually a good time for question and answer. So if anybody has any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free.
Again, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, you can use the raise hand icon in the bottom right toolbar, or you can drop something in the chat and I can read it aloud. I'm not seeing any questions at this time. Michelle, do we have any on the audio only line?
No, there are no questions on the audio only line.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe we can turn it back over to you, Caitlin, and then open the call up once again after the next steps in case folks are still formulating their questions or trying to figure out the raise hand tool.
Yeah, sounds good. Let's move to the next slide. Oh, we did get a question. Let's see. So real quick, let's look at this question. It's from Michael Sizzo with LADWP. There's been hedonic adjustments for CPI that makes it lower than earlier standards. Has that been examined?
Hey, Michael. I don't think I'm familiar with this hedonic adjustment, so I will certainly go and do some research on that and get back to you. And as Caitlin was saying, we'll put out, well, as she will explain, we'll be publishing a final proposal here. And so we'll use that paper to explain how we've considered the stakeholder feedback. And hopefully, if this comment comes in written form, we'll definitely answer it then. And I'll make an attempt to just keep a note of it and do the research and get back to you on that. So thanks, Michael.
All right, that's all I see for questions for now. So if we can move to the next slide, I will walk you through the next steps. Next slide, please. All right, so here's a brief overview of the initiative schedule. Last week, we posted the draft final proposal, and now we're having our stakeholder conference call. We will ask that you provide written comments on the draft final proposal August 14th by end of day. That comment template should be live on the initiative webpage now. And then shortly after we receive comments, we'll publish the draft tariff language and final proposal, and we'll have one more stakeholder conference call at the end of August and another round of comments, all with the goal of going to the September Board of Governors meeting and having the FERC filing and implementation completed sometime by the end of fall 2023. So I'll pause again here to see if we have any last minute questions before we close the call. I do see another question in the chat from Najin Liu with Idaho Power Company. How is hydro O&M adder work for hydro DEB calculation? Is this adder only applying to hydro bidding curves?
Yeah, I can respond back to that. So in an earlier slide, I had mentioned that the VOM adders are included in default energy bids. That was sort of a shortcut way of saying that they're applied to most default energy bid types. So the ISO has multiple different ways that a default energy bid or DEB can be calculated. The The primary one is what we call the variable cost DEB, and that's where we sort of build the individual components of a resource's costs and add those up. So fuel costs, variable operations and maintenance costs, maybe the grid management charge, sometimes greenhouse gas compliance costs, et cetera. We add those individual components up to come up with a dollar per megawatt hour value. There's other types of default energy bids that are used by different technology types. An example of those is the hydro default energy bid. And instead of being sort of a ground up calculation of what the resources costs are, the hydro DEB is sort of based on an opportunity cost model where it's formulated based on bilateral trading prices. In particular, well, it depends where the resource is located, but for example, a resource might trade at the mid-sea bilateral trading hub. So we use those bilateral market prices to come up with the opportunity cost of participating in the ISO's market compared to selling the energy in the bilateral markets. And then through that, we come up with a dollar per megawatt hour cost. And because that one's not a ground up calculation of the resources cost, instead it's looking at bilateral markets in an opportunity cost model, it doesn't include an explicit component for the variable operations and maintenance cost component. If Michelle, if you wouldn't mind going back to slide 9, please. You can see here that the default VOM component of for hydroelectric resources is 0. So the default value wouldn't even be included in the default energy bid because it's 0. But we do include 65 cents per run hour per megawatt in hydro resources minimum load costs. So let me explain that a little bit. So this 65 cents is meant to be reflective of the variable maintenance costs faced by hydro generators. And in particular, it's scaled based on the size of the resource. So it's a dollar per run hour cost, and that's scaled by the Pmax of the resource. So if you have a 100 megawatt hydro resource, you would receive $65 per run hour. So it's not included in the resources default energy bid, but it does result in a higher minimum load cost, and more specifically, a higher cap on what minimum load costs can be submitted by hydro resources. So it's kind of a long way of answering your question, which I guess there's two questions. How does it work for the hydro DEB? It's not included in the hydro DEB. And then 2, does the adder apply only to hydro bidding curves? Sort of. It allows for higher minimum load cost bids to be submitted by hydro resources.
All right, thanks for that. We do have a question also from Mike Whitney with NCPA. Is there a specific effective date target for the 16% increase?
Hey, Mike, thanks for the question. We can't commit to a official effective target date for these values quite yet, just because we still have to go through the tariff drafting process and get the Board of Governor approval and submit it at FERC and all those types of things. But the hope is to have it in later this year, if possible. It also depends on internal, resource constraints that the ISO might have. But it's a relatively pared down update to the default values. So we're targeting later this year, I think Q4. we are aiming to file in the fall of 2023. So I can't commit to an official date quite yet, but hopefully later this year.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have for questions at this time. Okay, great. So again, please submit your comments on the draft final proposal and some of the discussion happening today. Those comments will be due end of day, August 14th. Again, that comment template should be live on the initiative webpage right now, and you can access that using the link there on the second bullet point of the slide. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at isostakeholderaffairs@kaiser.com. And thanks again for joining, and we will see you at the next stakeholder meeting on August 31st. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for joining today's conference, and thank you for using event services. The conference has ended, and you may disconnect.